You guys remember Jonah, right? You know, the guy who was sleeping through a crazy supernatural storm? Well, last week wasn't just about Jonah being a heavy sleeper. This told us a lot more. See, Jonah's sleeping was symbolic of his current relationship with God. This running from God led him to a place of complete spiritual apathy. So here's how things played out. The storm was getting more and more intense, and the sailors came looking for Jonah, who they find fast asleep. When they wake him, Jonah confesses that the only way this storm will rest and they'll survive is if the sailors throw Jonah overboard into the water and let him die. Now, don't be misled by what appears to be a selfless act by Jonah. No, in fact, this might have been Jonah's most selfish act yet. I mean, he's on the run from God. And what's the surest way that Jonah could ever avoid going to Nineveh? Death. But the sailors, fearing they might be destroyed by the storm, threw Jonah overboard. And this is where we pick up the story tonight. Jonah is sinking into the depths of the sea, thinking he's just won this fight with God. And what happens? God appoints a fish to go and swallow up Jonah. Will this be the end of Jonah's story? Let's find out.
All right, students, I want you to think back to a time where you've been misunderstood. Here's what I mean by that. Maybe you're having a conversation with a friend, and another friend comes up behind you and is just walking by, and they hear one sentence from your conversation, and they begin to think something that's completely different than what you were actually saying because they didn't have the full context. They just heard one sentence from one conversation, but it really did sound like, just from that one sentence, that maybe you were talking bad about them. Or maybe you were saying something about someone else and they begin to hear that and spread this story, like a different narrative or a different story than the one that you actually were meaning to be told because they didn't have the context. That could be really damaging. Here's kind of a funny example of how that could play out. Hopefully you don't find yourself in a situation, probably you won't. But just imagine with me that your mom asked you, hey, I need you to come to the grocery store with me, got this huge list, I need your help. And so we're gonna divide up the list and you're gonna find some items and I'm gonna find some of the items. So she sends you to find cereal. You're on the cereal aisle. You notice two people having a conversation at the end of the aisle. You can't hear what they're saying, but as you get closer, you're not really trying to either, but as you get closer, you suddenly begin to pick up some of the words they're saying, and you hear one sentence. And you hear this girl say to this other girl, I'm going to kill him. Pause, time out. Everything stops. Why? Because you know how bad it can be if you misunderstand someone or you misinterpret. You've experienced what that's like, and so you don't want to do that to this person. And so you have some options that you got to run through. Option number one, maybe she's planning to kill somebody, right? That could legitimately be the option. Maybe someone's really upset her and she's like, that's it, it's over, I'm killing him. But that doesn't have to necessarily be what she's saying, because that sentence can be interpreted a bunch of different ways. Maybe it's option number two. Maybe she just got a brand new puppy dog and she's really nervous about taking care of it. And she's like, man, I've been feeding him so much. 13 times I've fed him today. And I don't know, am I doing things right? Like, I'm just really nervous. I'm afraid I'm going to kill him, right? And that's a silly example, but maybe she's meaning that. Or maybe option number three, maybe she's a writer. And she's writing a story and she's got to get the final copy into the editor and she's trying to run by her friend. What do you think I should do? I don't know if I should kill the main character. I'm not sure if I should kill him. Like, again, we see the situation again where someone could misunderstand what's saying. And again, that's a funny situation. You'll probably never find yourself in that type of situation, but definitely situations like that. So we kind of can understand how misunderstanding or misinterpreting can be dangerous. But what's the solution? Well, the solution is understanding the context. You might have to go up to this person and ask them, hey, this is really awkward, really embarrassing, but are you planning to kill somebody? Like, I don't know how you would actually handle that situation, but the point is you would have to get more information somehow, some way to understand the context, to really get what was happening. As we look at the book of Jonah, chapter 2 tonight, we're going to have to do just that. We're going to have to get some context because Jonah chapter 2 is actually one of the most misunderstood chapters in all of Scripture. Like, a lot of times when we come to this chapter, it's the point where Jonah gets swallowed by a fish. People begin to misunderstand the fish. And so if the fish was here today with us, and the fish was to communicate to us, this is what it would say. It would be like, don't miss the point. Don't read this one line, this one sentence about me swallowing up a human being and him living to tell about it, and don't make that the point of the story. If you do that, it's the same thing as hearing one sentence in a conversation and then making the whole story about that one sentence. It's like context is important. So we got to understand the context of the story of Jonah before we continue. So I'm going to remind you of where we're at. Jonah is a prophet who's been running from God. Like that's the overall picture of the story. And here in this moment, we're going to see that all of Jonah's running, all of his disobedience, all of his rebellion, he was the captain of his own ship running from God. In this moment right here, all of it comes crashing down. Jonah's no longer in control. Jonah's facing the full-blown consequences of his sin. And so the question, the point of the fish is to create an opportunity or a space where we're going to see how Jonah and God interact with each other in this moment. All right? So if you have your Bibles, turn to the end of chapter 1. We're going to start in verse 17 and then move on into chapter 2. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried out, and you heard my voice, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. So here we see Jonah in the belly of the fish, and we think, and I think even Jonah's a little bit surprised here, like, how am I still alive? Like the whole point of this whole situation where Jonah threw himself into the sea was an act of his rebellion. Like he was trying to say to God, this is how far I'm willing to go to be disobedient to you, to run away from you. I will never go to Nineveh. In fact, I'm going to take my own life to ensure that. And so God appoints this fish, and this fish swallows up Jonah. And Jonah's here saying, like, how am I not dead? In this moment, Jonah becomes very aware of what's going on. The first thing that he becomes aware of is his condition. Like Jonah realizes here in this moment, I'm in the belly of Sheol, or the belly of the grave is the words that Jonah uses. I am in a watery tomb and I can do nothing. Jonah begins to see, hey, this is where my sin has taken me. I've been running from God for so long, and I've come up to this moment right now where I'm facing the full consequences of my sin. And I need help. Jonah's at the end of himself. Have you ever been in a situation, students, where all you had left was to cry out for help? Because that's where Jonah's at. Jonah is here and he's saying, God, I need you. But not only is he aware of his condition, that he needs help, but Jonah also becomes aware of the situation. Like he looks back, and through the course, from the moment he said, no, God, I'm running from you. I'm not going to Nineveh. I'm going to Tarshish. Jonah becomes vividly aware of how God has been working throughout this situation. Right? Listen to what he says again at the end of verse 3. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Jonah looks at this story. He looks at the narrative that's been taking place, and he says, I see your hand in it all. From the moment that I started running, it was you, O God, that brought the storm. It was you, O God, that threatened to break the ship apart when I was asleep in the bottom of it. It was you, O God, that caused the sailors to ask me, which God do you worship? It was you, O God. Even though the sailors were the ones that threw me into the waters, I see your hand in this all. This was your doing. Jonah becomes aware of his situation. This is a scary place for Jonah to be, right? When the person you've wronged is the person that you need to call out to for help, is the same person, that's a very difficult situation to be. Jonah's been running from God, and now he needs God's help. So how is God going to respond to Jonah in this moment? Here's a way to illustrate that. When I was growing up, I had a younger brother named Kevin. And a lot of times, there was one moment in my life when I was really bigger than Kevin. He's much bigger than me now, so I would not dare pick on him in this moment. He would really hurt me. But when I was older than him and he was smaller than me, I would oftentimes pick on him. I had this ball that was like almost like a bouncy ball, but it was like the size of a baseball, so it had some weight to it. And I would torture Kevin when he was being annoying to me, right? And I would take this ball and I would just pelt him with it over and over again. A lot of times he would end up running around the house and he would find himself like jumping onto the sofa and like kind of like guarding himself with pillows and things like that. Well, one of the moments I ripped the pillow off and he was just having his arms and his hands in the way, and I'm throwing this ball repeatedly over and over again. People are like, Kyle, you are an evil person. But here's the reality. I threw this ball, it hit the wall, and on the coffee table right in front of this couch was this vase. And this was a special vase. It was one of those vases that my parents only put out during like holiday seasons. Not that it was festive, but that it was really nice, really important. They only put it out when people were coming over. And so I threw this ball. It bounces off the wall. I promise you, I promise you that ball, if it hit the vase, it barely hit the vase. Barely hit it, but the vase ends up falling over and shattering on the ground. Immediately, I drop to my knees, and I'm like picking up all the pieces, like trying to like weigh out my life right now because I know it's probably about to be over. And I'm calling to Kevin. I'm like, Kevin, dude, you got to come help me. Like, you got to help me pick this up. And we're like, I'm trying to get all the pieces picked up. Kevin, go get a broom, go get something, go find glue. I'm calling out all these commands. And I eventually look up, and here's what I notice. Kevin is not on the couch anymore. Kevin is nowhere to be found. He's not in the kitchen getting a dustpan. He's not in the kitchen getting a broom. He's not anywhere to be found. Eventually, I find him, and where Kevin is he's lying on his bed on his phone. And I walk in there, I'm like, Kevin, what are you doing? Like, I need your help, bro. Like, seriously, this is it. And Kevin's laughing, and he looks at me, he's like, there's no way I'm going to be helping you. You were literally just torturing me. You're on your own, right? Like, in fact, Kevin was like, I'm going to make it my goal to make sure mom and dad find out that you were the one that did this. When the person that you were hurting or the person that you were causing trouble to is also the person that you need to call out for help, that's usually not a good place to be, because for that person, it's often a moment like, here comes my revenge. Like, oh, sweet revenge. And Kevin took full advantage of that. I feel like that's the situation that we see Jonah in. Jonah's been running from God. He's been rebelling against him, saying, God, I hate you. I don't care about the vision that you have for your life. I'm going to go my own way. And the consequence of all of Jonah's sin and all of his actions are lining up in this moment when Jonah is in the belly of the fish, this watery tomb, and all he has left to do is cry out to the one that he's been hurting. How is God going to respond to Jonah? Let's pick up in verse 4. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. This is Jonah talking. He said, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. The water closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you, he's talking to God, yet you, God, have brought me up. You have brought my life up from the pit. O Lord, my God, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you and to your holy temple. There's a couple of lines in this prayer that we see from Jonah as he's praying to God. We're like, yep, that makes sense. Yeah, you are running from God. You are driven from his sight. God is upset with you. But there is also this cadence of God saving Jonah. Right? He's like, when my life was fainting away, when I was drawing my last breath, you came down and rescued me. You brought my life up. That's not the type of imagery that I would be expecting to find. Jonah's been running from God, showing hatred to God, exhibiting his belligerent rebellion towards God, but yet God reaches down and brings his life up. There's a line that I want us to connect with that Jonah says, and he says it twice in this prayer. He says, my prayer has gone in, or I've cast my eyes again upon the temple, the holy temple. And to the Jewish people, that was super significant. That language was very clear. Because the temple was the place where God's presence dwelt. Now I can tell you this, if I had upset someone, the place I wouldn't go stand in their presence. I wouldn't want to go and be with them. In fact, I'd want them to cool down for a moment. I would want to maybe figure out some way that I can lessen the blow, and then I would go and approach them. But no. Jonah, in the midst of his rebellion, like he had just admitted that I've been running from you. I am sinking into the depths to take my own life so that I will never have to go to Nineveh and be obedient to you. In that moment, Jonah enters into the presence of God. His prayer goes to the holy temple. Students, that might just begin to help us understand the grace that God has. And Jonah begins to experience that because the whole reason why he was running is because he did not want God to show mercy and grace. He knew that God was so merciful and so gracious that he would find a way to forgive the Ninevites. In this moment, Jonah's like, hey, the same reason why I've been running is the same reason why I might need you in this moment, is that you would show grace to me, for I am a sinner. Jonah has this moment when he realizes, even though I've been running, I can go to the temple. Students, is that not us oftentimes? Like when we are in the thick of the mess, we've messed up, we've sinned against God. The list is endless of the things that we could do that God has told us, hey, this is not my vision for your life. And we have begun to run. We have begun to run. The last place we often go is to the presence of God. And students, we have it even better than Jonah. Because here's the reality. The hot spot of God's grace, the hot spot of God's presence for the Jewish person was the temple. But for us, the hot spots of God's grace, the hot spot of God's presence is the cross of Christ. So the reality is the better Jonah came, and his name was Jesus. And he took on all the sin, all the running, all the rebellion upon himself. And the wrath of God was satisfied in that moment upon Jesus. It rested there. And God poured out all of his anger for the things that we had done, all of his wrath, all of his holy and righteous wrath upon Christ. And we have been given access into the presence of God because of this. So we have access to the hot spot of God's grace, because the wrath of God was satisfied forever. So God no longer looks at us even in the midst of our mess. And he doesn't look at us with wrath, but with grace. Jonah models that for us here. Students, that's what you have available. That's the whole point of this fish. This fish becomes a vehicle of God's grace. Something that could appear to be a vehicle of judgment, where Jonah would just eventually die away, becomes a vehicle of God's grace. Becomes a vehicle where Jonah realizes God is a God of mercy, and I need that mercy. Here's how the story ends. Jonah chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. But I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Then God does this. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon dry land. And that's where chapter 2 ends. And we're going to continue in our series through Jonah over the next few weeks. But the point of tonight is this: that our sin does not keep us from the presence of God. Because of Christ, we have access into his holy temple. We have access to his grace and his mercy. He has made that possible through Jesus on the cross. And so this is one of the moments when I would say, hey, listen, there's nothing that you can do that can keep you out of that. There's no sin that can amount large enough where God says, no, because of what you've done, you no longer get access. God works in our hearts. He uses things that seem impossible. For Jonah, he used a fish. He used a fish to bring him to a moment where he cast his eye and he said, I am aware of my need for you. I'm aware that you have been working in my life. And now I will enter in the midst of my mess. I don't need to clean myself up. I just need to step in to the holy presence of God. Students, that's available to you on the cross. And so tonight in small group, dive into that. The grace and freedom that has been granted towards you because of what Christ has done.